And today I have I would say, the world's leading expert on this book. You are noted for your Hebrew Bible research. If I were someone who really needed the answer
in the book of Daniel, I think, to establish his character, and I think that is why they wanted to have a Median king.
What classicists would term realisms.
Author of the book of Daniel actually thought there was a Darius the Mede. So you tell the story about the more famous person. From Daniel's point of view, this was a completely irrational.
Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. I have a treat for you today. We're going to tackle Daniel, the book of Daniel, a prophetic piece of literature, but it's not all about prophecy. It's full of fantastic tales that still resonate in our imagination today. And today I have I would say, the world's leading expert on this book, someone who spent over 40 years dissecting it and trying to analyze and understand the book of Daniel, and that is Dr. John J. Collins. Welcome back, my friend.
Good to be back.
Thank you. You are emeritus from Yale Divinity. You were born in Ireland, but you're an American biblical scholar. You're Holmes professor, or were Holmes professor of Old Testament criticism and interpretation, if I'm correct.
Correct.
You are noted for your Hebrew Bible research, Dead Sea Scrolls studies, apocalyptic stuff. You have several books. I loved the apocalyptic imagination. I go through your series all the time to try and wrap my head around what's going on here. And let's just hone in and waste no time. The book of Daniel is a very pivotal text used by not only late Second Temple Jews in their writings. We find Habakkuk, Pesher, at least this continuation of redating and calculating the fulfilled prophecies they expect. But even in Christianity, the Son of Man, dealing with the book of Revelation, which your wonderful wife wrote a powerful book on the combat myth pertaining to John's revelation. We've talked about Daniel before, John, but and just so everybody knows, he doesn't mind me calling him John. We're friends. In case someone online goes, you better be professional here. But if I were someone who really needed the answer, not just an authority figure such as yourself to say, Daniel made predictions, Daniel was wrong. We need to know why and what he predicted. What did he get wrong about the ancient world, maybe, that kind of gives us signals that he wasn't actually in Babylon, whoever this author is? Who is Daniel and how does he get it wrong? Is there a way you want to paint this picture leading up to how we can be certain that he was wrong about predictions?
Well, let's start maybe with things in the book of Daniel that relate to the past, which are generally more easily verified or falsified than things relating to the future. And in the first half of the book of Daniel, you have a collection of stories. Most of these chapters are in Aramaic, and they evidently circulated and grew over time. But they're put in the book of Daniel, I think, to establish his character and give him an identity. But they include some whoppers, such as the reign of one Darius the Mede. Now, we know a good deal, about Persian history because the Greek historians wrote about it. There was no Darius the Mede. Now, the Medes never ruled over Babylon directly. They were a joint kingdom with the Persians at one point. Darius was a famous Persian king. So we actually have a pretty good idea why they created this character of Darius the Mede, because there was a schema that was well known in the ancient world of a series of world kingdoms. And the typical way that runs is you have the Assyrians, the Medes, the Persians, and then the Greeks. This would change over time, and the Romans would come in, and the Medes and Persians would be combined. Outside of the book of Daniel, though, it starts with Assyria. In the book of Daniel, it starts with Babylon. And for fairly obvious reasons, it was Babylon that did in Jerusalem. But they still kept Mede. The Medes never had anything to do with the Jews. The Medes were up north, and they really didn't intrude on Judea at all. But they're kept in there by the power of tradition. And I think that is why they wanted to have a Median king. And they thought, well, Darius will do.
Do you
Uh,
think it's partly also what classicists would term realisms, or they're
yeah,
kind of trying to invent verisimilitude? Like, you can trust me, I know a little history, even though they're inventing it.
you see, it raises one of the most fundamental questions that you have when you read anything is genre. What kind of thing are you reading? Now, if you're reading a comedian, somebody who's doing a lampoon of something, and you're taking it all dead seriously, you're going to be way off. So we've always come to these books because they're in the Bible and we think they must be all deadly serious. And this isn't necessarily the case. Is it the case that the author of the book of Daniel actually thought there was a Darius the Mede? I kind of doubt it, actually. I mean, if you read a novel nowadays with a fictitious character in it, do you assume that the author is just uneducated?
Right.
Or do you allow for the possibility that he's actually making up a character? We think we can ignore that. I think Udella will get it. Yeah. So that, I think, is what you've got to deal with there. The other famous one like that is in Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's madness. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was a famous king. If he had gone mad and been turned into become like a beast, we'd have heard of that somewhere. And in fact, we can trace the development of that particular story too. And one of the links in the chain was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in that one, the king is Nabonidus. Nabonidus came after Nebuchadnezzar. He's a very unpopular king in Babylon because he was devoted to the moon god. He was a Mooni. And he went off to the desert, to Tema, to build a temple to the moon god and neglected the cult in Babylon. And because of this, we have a text from the ancient Near East that's a satire on Nabonidus, that's just making fun of him. Now, this idea of his sojourn in the wilderness, that's what gives rise to the legend of him being turned into a beast. And then, when they got to telling this story in Jewish circles a couple of hundred years later, nobody had heard of Nabonidus. Everybody had heard of Nebuchadnezzar. So you tell the story about the more famous person. This kind of thing happens in American tradition too. Stories will get attached to George Washington rather than to some obscure figure that nobody ever heard of. So that much, I think, says a good deal about the kind of stories you have in the first half of the book of Daniel. They're playing fast and loose with history. They're not history lessons. They're telling you colorful stories to make a point.
Which I think is why it's still such a powerful book, right?
Oh, it is.
But it also helps us answer a question of, was this guy around at that time? Huge red flags to suggest that this would mean no. If he was there, he would have just put the correct character and even still told the story without getting the wrong kind of information. But we can put that to the side right now because that's not as solid of the evidence that really makes people pinpoint when this guy writes. So you're painting this really fantastic story. Please continue.
Well, that's the first part of the book. And it's all about characters who supposedly lived in the 6th century BCE. Now, whether they did or not, you start out with Nebuchadnezzar and you work your way down till Cyrus the Persian is about to come at the end of Daniel chapter 6. And the stories are schematized, to reflect this sequence of Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece. And you get as far as Persia in the first half of the book. And then in Daniel 7, you back up to Belshazzar. Belshazzar actually wasn't king at all, but he ruled in Babylon while Nabonidus was off in Tema. So you back up to Belshazzar and then you start all over again. But then from chapter 7 on, the punchline of every chapter has to do with events in Jerusalem in the 2nd century BC. Now, there's really no dispute about this. I think all the most fundamentalist of fundamentalist scholars would agree but they would say that this was all prophesied by Daniel several hundred years beforehand.
Of course.
But then you got to ask yourself, why was it that Daniel gave such intensive prophecies about a few years in the 160s BC and nothing beyond that? So now he actually had pretty good information about what was happening, because in chapter 11, he's talking, the angel Gabriel is giving him a history lesson, but he is supposedly giving it to him as a prediction. He says, I will tell you what's written in the book of truth and what is going to happen. And it starts off, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia. Actually, they weren't so good on Persian history. There were more than 3 kings after the time this was supposedly spoken. But anyway, the 4th shall be far richer than all of them, and he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. That a warrior king shall arise and shall rule with great dominion, and that is Alexander the Great. Nowadays we can cheat. You can have an annotated Bible, or you can look it up in Wikipedia. I think everybody in the ancient world was supposed to know who this great king was. And while still rising in power, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven. Because Alexander died young, and his kingdom was divided among his generals, who are known as the Diadochi. And 2 of these become very important for the story. There's one of them in Syria. He is called the King of the North, and one in Egypt who is called the King of the South. And no names being mentioned, part of the technique, part of the genre here is that you make it sound like somebody is seeing this dimly. So you don't want to be too specific about it.
Very clever, by the way.
Yes. Then the King of the South shall grow strong, but one of his again, you can go through this with an annotated Bible, and you work your way on down until a figure comes on the scene in 1121. In his place shall arise a contemptible person, to whom royal majesty had not been conferred. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom through intrigue. Armies shall be swept away before him, and so forth. And he shall stir up his power and determination against the king of the south with a great army. Now, if you've been correlating this with what's happening in the Hellenistic period, this is clearly enough Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And he invaded Egypt. He invaded Egypt actually twice. And he wanted to put his nephew on the throne. But actually, there's some speculation that he wanted to be king himself of Egypt. But anyhow, the king of the south shall wage war against him.
This is Egypt. The king of the south is the Egyptian king that's fighting against Antiochus.
Yes. And then the king of the north, Antiochus, shall return to his land with great wealth. But his heart shall be set against the Holy Covenant. Well, that's just kind of a gratuitous comment for the moment. At the time appointed, he shall return and come into the south. That's his second invasion of Egypt in 168. But this time it shall not be as it was before. For ships of the Kittim shall come against him and cause him to lose heart and withdraw. Now, we have an account of that in the Roman historians. And the way the story goes, a Roman legate named Popilius Laenas met him on the beach outside Alexandria at a place called Eleusis, and demanded that he withdraw from Egypt, and drew a circle around him in the sand and said he wanted his answer before he stepped out of that circle. Now, Antiochus, even though Antiochus was sometimes referred to as the madman, he had called himself Epiphanes, which means God made manifest. And some people called him Epimanes, the madman. But he was no fool. And when the Romans told him that he needed to reply before he stepped out of that circle, he replied, and he withdrew from Egypt. He wasn't about, to get into a war with Rome. His father had done that, and it had been a disaster. They were still paying off the debts. Now, it is after that, it says, he shall lose heart and withdraw. So he withdrew from Egypt. He shall be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. It is on his way back from Egypt that he sacks Jerusalem. Now, why did he do that? Well, we have an account of that in 2nd Maccabees, and the one in 2nd Maccabees has much more detail than the account in 1st Maccabees. So, what had happened? When he was in Egypt, a rumor spread in Jerusalem that he had been killed. Now, there had been a dispute going on as to who should be high priest. And there was a man named Jason who had gone to the king and promised him more money if he would make him high priest. And the king said, "Great idea, you're high priest." And so he got rid of the legitimate high priest. And then a little bit later, a man named Menelaus was taking the tribute to the king, and he said, if you made me high priest, I'd give you more. And so the king said, even better idea. And so Menelaus became high priest. And now Jason tried to get the high priesthood back. So Jason attacked Menelaus, and in effect, a civil war broke out in Jerusalem. When the king heard this, he took it that all Judea was in revolt. And he had just been humiliated in Egypt, and so on the way back, it says, forces, he shall be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. Forces by him shall occupy and profane the temple and the fortress. The fortress is, it's really, the temple itself was fortified. If you've been to Jerusalem and seen the Temple Mount, you know the kind of thing we're talking about.
Right.
Now, what was he actually trying to do? And there's been endless debate about this, and you will not get it clearly stated, you see, in the sources. I mean, from Daniel's point of view, this was a completely irrational action by the king. Nowadays, they would accuse him of anti-Semitism. If the assumption is it's an ideological hostility to the Jewish people or the people of Judea. But now what he probably was doing, the best account I've ever found of it, is that when a king conquered an area, it was the custom to permit the people to live according to their ancestral laws. But this was given as a privilege by the king. And what Antiochus Epiphanes was probably doing was withdrawing that privilege. That means you cannot live according to your ancestral laws. If you live according to your ancestral laws, you're a distinct people. And what he wanted to do was say, no more Judah. He wasn't trying to suppress the Jewish religion. He wasn't trying to interfere with Jewish communities outside of Judea. But he was trying to destroy what was distinctive about Judea and make them like everybody else in his empire. So that's what he was doing. If you allow for the fact that Daniel, sees this as completely irrational, it's a well-informed account. He goes on, forces by him shall occupy and profane the temple and the fortress. They shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate. Now, these are the things that kind of run through the book of Daniel, and you get them in First Maccabees too. So, first of all, the normal cult, a sacrifice in the morning and a sacrifice in the evening, and he abolishes that. From the viewpoint of a real believer in Judaism, this was disastrous.
Right.
This is how you stave off the anger of God, by giving him his breakfast and his supper. So this would have been disastrous. And on top of that, he erects what's called the abomination that makes desolate. Now, it's again not all that clear just what that is. Prevailing explanation of it is that it was in pagan temples, in Syrian temples, they had typically horned altars. And apparently he put one of these horned altars on top of the great altar of sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple. And this was said to make desolate. And that in Hebrew, it's shikutz meshomem. Shikutz is an abomination.
Right.
It's the same word that gives you shiksa. So, it's bad. Meshomem, I think, and this was proposed more than 100 years ago, was a pun on Baal Shamem, Baal of the heavens, who would have been the main god worshipped in Syria.
So technically this, and just help me connect the dots here, because I'm thinking of the golden calf, I'm thinking of Josiah's reforms, I'm thinking of all of these kind of images from horned bull type figures, El, Baal, these other figures like you're describing. So this is potentially the answer. I've heard people try to say he was putting Zeus in there or something like that. I've heard that.
You see, Baal Shamem would have been identified with Zeus Olympios. This was one of the things that the Greeks did when they went to a place, was they tried to figure if they met a deity that they didn't know before. They asked, now, could this be somebody we know by a different name? And so they established a set of coincidences. Actually, the popular one for the god of Israel was Dionysus, and that's because of all the wine that was used in the worship. But I think this is what he's describing.
One note on desolation, just going to the Gospels for 1 second, and I know that's not your specific focus, you're a Hebrew Bible scholar, but you have written and published, and you know extensively about late Second Temple Judaism, and this is late Second Temple Judaism that we find in this literature. I've had some make interesting observations. I don't know how convinced you are, but the abomination of desolation, or that makes desolate in the Jerusalem temple, which I think is hinting, in my opinion, I think Mark, Matthew, and Luke are aware of the destruction that took place of the temple. But some say this might have been a sign of Caligula going in and setting up an image, or attempting to, like they're getting signs, and some even think Paul is hinting at this with the man of sin who's trying to set himself up for worship. Could be Caligula, could be Nero, one of these emperors. Are you persuaded by any particular interpretation on those points?
Not by any particular one, but I think it is obviously some pagan signum. Now, it could be even Roman banners. It could be a statue of the emperor. It could be a statue of a pagan god. I think what it means in the New Testament is probably different from what it meant in Daniel's original context.
Right.
But it is some symbol of pagan religion or pagan power that they figured didn't belong in the temple.
You would never interpret that as these are rebels or zealots or Jews in any way.
No. I mean, it's coming from the imperial side. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I think, in the case of Daniel, it is something that is associated with Baal Shemaim. Now, it's not inconceivable that it was a statue. The explanation that's most commonly accepted is that it was a pagan altar that was installed. Now, this is in line with what you read in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And so the assumption is Daniel is doing fine here. He will seduce with intrigue those who violate the covenant. So some people say, yes, your majesty, this is what you want, this is what we will do. But the people who are loyal to their God shall stand firm and take action. What action will they take? Some people would say that must be the Maccabees. I don't actually think so.
Really?
Because it says the wise among the people. Now, these may not be the only people who take action, but they're the people that the book of Daniel relates to and regards as the heroes. The wise among the people shall give understanding to many. So what do they do? What's the action that they take? They will explain to people what's really going on.
So no violence necessarily.
No violence. We'll get to that.
Okay.
Why not? But they will explain. Now, what is this understanding that they will give them?
Right.
Now, if you've ever read anything by Richard Horsley,
yes,
Richard would say, these were scribes explaining the Torah. The Torah doesn't come up at all in this. The only understanding that comes up in this is what you've been getting in the visions of Daniel. And what you had in chapter 10 is that the real battle is being fought upstairs. You think that this is a battle between Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabees, but actually it's a battle between the Prince of Greece, an angel, and Michael, the Prince of Israel. And that's the struggle that's going to determine what happens on earth.
May I just point out one thing, and I'd love to get your comments on this, because Elaine Pagels was instrumental in my observation on Origins of Satan, how much on the spiritual realm, an alternative realm, that there were, celestial battles and wars between principalities and rulers. We see it in Paul, and how they actually, while they're speaking in this language, like you're describing a prince, an angel of Greece, or these spiritual beings, these godly beings, immortal beings are fighting. There is a reflection often that humans are also doing that. So I guess my question is saying, while it is talking about what you're saying, is it also possibly reflecting what's going on between the Maccabees and Antiochus in your view?
Well, let's see what he says first.
Okay.
The wise among the people shall give understanding to many. For some days, however, they shall fall by sword and flame and suffer captivity and plunder. When they fall victim, they shall receive little help. NRSV says a little help. I would prefer to just say little help, which is to say not much. Now, St. Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, said that this was a slighting reference to the Maccabees. And that's been a very influential opinion. Whether it's right, I'm not sure. Some of the wise shall fall, so that they may be refined, purified, and cleansed until the time of the end, for there is still an interval until the time appointed. Now, it doesn't say anything about they will eventually drive out the Greeks. It doesn't say anything about the wise winning a battle. They will fall by sword, captivity, and plunder. But the main concern for them seems to be that they teach, they impart understanding, and that they are purified. Now, there's another text that many people think was written about the same time called the Assumption of Moses. And that tells a story of a persecution that's very much like this. And there the father takes his sons to go into a field and say, let us purify for ourselves for 3 days and die. For if we do this, our blood will be avenged before the Lord. Now, there's a story in First Maccabees about some people in the time of trouble who fled to the wilderness, and the soldiers surrounded them on the Sabbath. And these were pietists, and they wouldn't fight on the Sabbath. So they were all killed. And the Maccabees said, to hell with that.
Right.
You know, it's all right to break one commandment if you can then be alive to keep the rest of them. So I figure Daniel was on the side of the people in the cave, or was more like the people in the cave. But really, to circle back now, though, to your question of how do we know that Daniel was wrong, got some things wrong. Up to this point, you see, everything that has been supposedly prophesied happened. Then it says the king shall act as he pleases. He shall pay no respect to the gods of his ancestors, and so forth. And at the time of the end, in verse 40, the king of the south shall attack him. The king of Egypt did not attack the king of Syria after these things happened in Jerusalem. The king of the north shall crush him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen. He shall come into the beautiful land, and tens of thousands shall fall victim. Again, this did not happen. You know, he sent soldiers to Jerusalem at one point, but this would have been a little bit earlier in the story. But the king didn't just invade Judea. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But reports from the east and the north shall alarm him. He shall go out with great fury to bring ruin and complete destruction to many. And then you get to the crucial point. He shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with no one to help him. So it is predicting that the king of Syria, Antiochus IV, would invade Judea and die between the sea and the holy mountain. In fact, he died out in the east.
Beyond the Euphrates somewhere, probably.
In 164. Yeah.
Yeah. And the Holy Mountain, just so anyone has a geographic idea, this particular Holy Mountain, is this somewhere in the region of Judea in the north here near
No, this is Mount Zion in Jerusalem.
Okay.
Now, I mean, that is how certainly any Jew would take it.
Got it.
The beautiful holy mountain is Mount Zion.
Even though there's several holy mountains described in the earlier tradition.
You go there now and you say, where's the mountain? But
yeah, I know what you mean. I just wanted to emphasize that because by this time, as Jonathan Adler and others have pointed out, you know, you have a pretty confident, developed form, at least, of Judaism around this period that is happening. I'm not saying canon was, you know, there was no fixed canon, but like there is a formulation of sacred literature and religious practice that we would consider Judaism at this point, and being Jerusalem is the central heart of God's temple and such. So Antiochus dies where he shouldn't. Details that are described about him don't happen, though they continue that same predictive power with the same kind of, there's no shift in complete change, but it sounds like it's the same kind of thing that came before that was accurate. And then after that point, it just everything from that point on gets wrong.
Everything from that point on hasn't happened.
Got it.
And remember back when I first wrote on this, there's a professor in Belfast who was a respected professor on the Septuagint, but was a fundamentalist, I think. And, he wrote to me and said, well, obviously, these last 6 verses, that those are not about Antiochus Epiphanes. Those are about the Antichrist, who is yet to come.
Right.
And so why then do you suddenly jump from Antiochus Epiphanes to the Antichrist?
Of course, they have a different hermeneutic when you're dealing with the sacred.
Their hermeneutic would be, it can't be about Antiochus Epiphanes because that didn't happen.
Right.
And it's not, they just don't allow for a possibility that Daniel could have gotten some things wrong.
Exactly. This takes me, and I know we're dealing with different genre, different literature, different time. It's fast forwarding, 200 years practically, when the literature we call the Gospels pops up, and the Son of Man is harking back to Daniel, this language that we find in Judaism. And a lot of people read in the more conservative circles, and the groups I came out of called preterism. There are various forms of it. I'm not getting into all the interpretations, but to simply put, you wrote an article that you sent me before you published, and I hope you published it by now, but if not, people are getting a sneak peek, is on Mark, you were kind of tackling some of N.T. Wright's points. And Mark sounds to me, help me out with this, to be describing Roman soldiers surrounding Jerusalem, the idea of destruction that's coming to Jerusalem, and a lot of the details in there. He uses biblical language, meaning he uses Daniel type language, as any good Jew would do, oftentimes in a midrashic way, reapplying it to their context and such. But is there any clear signal in your view in Mark, Matthew, or Luke that the events being described predict things that don't come to pass? In a similar fashion, here are some, we know stuff, but we're predicting it. Remember, this is coming from Jesus's mouth in the 30s. Hint, hint, I'm writing this after the war. Similar to Daniel, anonymous author, we'll just say Mark, Matthew, and Luke, for the sake of brevity, predicting the war that you see is coming, and it's already happened technically. Is there any point in which you'd say, hey, this is where he's predicting something? These are signs of the end. They think because of this war that happened in 70, and then now we're dealing with failure. Is there anything in your view?
Yes, I'm just looking here at Mark 13. You can read along down, and a lot of it has happened. And if the Lord had not cut short those days, and no one would be saved. If anyone says to you at that time, look, here is the Messiah, or look, there he is, do not believe it. False messiahs and false prophets will appear and produce signs and omens and lead astray, if possible, the elect. But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light.
Right.
This can be also hyperbolic language.
Right.
But then they will see the Son of Man coming with great power and glory. He will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds of heaven, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. If that has happened, Derek, we are among the left behind.
So technically, you can see how someone would try to make that hyperbolic, to try to make that symbolic or something, and not take that at face value.
That's what Tom Wright does.
Got it. Now, this gets into a more technical thing we don't have time to get into today, but I try to describe to someone that you have this kind of hyperbolic metaphorical language for resurrection in Ezekiel and other passages in scripture. However, by the time this literature is coming up, Jews are literally burying their dead in bone boxes, expecting an actual resurrection. There seems to be help me out.
Hold a minute here. The bone boxes have nothing to do with expecting resurrection. I think the bone box is long before that.
Okay. Help me out. Correct me.
The bone boxes, it was a way of being gathered to your ancestors.
Okay. I thought there was some significance to it.
Ideally, you were buried in the same tomb as your parents and your grandparents. And then, at some point, somebody tidies up and puts the bones in boxes. And that's just a way of, creating order. Now, if you believed in resurrection, I suppose, then you might relate it to that. But not all Jews did.
Got it.
But, but the belief in resurrection was certainly prior to the resurrection of Jesus.
Absolutely.
As Paul says, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised.
That's an odd thing to say. I'm a skeptic. I'm not persuaded. That's an odd thing to say if you take my point of view, right? As I'm approaching this critically, and I'm thinking, why would he say that? He says he rose, but he's maybe being rhetorical with the Corinthians and saying hey, look, if you don't buy this resurrection thing that we Jews have had, or maybe he's saying something to that effect.
You see, he's writing to the Corinthians, and he's writing to people who had great trouble with the idea of resurrection of the dead. Mind you, not unreasonably.
Right.
I
can relate.
The evidence is not overwhelming, shall we say. You don't meet people walking around raised from the dead. So that's, I think, why Paul puts it that way. Now, and Daniel is the only book, I would say, in the Hebrew Bible who has a real resurrection. At that time, Michael, the great prince, protector of your people, shall arise. This tells you, where the real battle is being fought, in heaven. And at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. That is also an innovation. because not all your people will be saved. Only those who are written in the book.
Right.
He's keeping a book, he's writing it twice, and he's putting in who's naughty and who's nice. And if you're not nice, you can sleep on. But many of those who sleep, and it's actually in the land of dust. It's usually translated in the dust of the earth, but it's in the land of dust. And I think that means Sheol, the netherworld, shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Daniel doesn't say that they will come back and get bodies back. Now, I think, what is raised must have some kind of body, but it's probably a transparent body. There are stories like this in the New Testament, where Jesus comes in through a locked door. So, it's the kind of body a ghost has. And then, those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the sky. They'll become like the stars. And others then go to shame and everlasting contempt. So that, in a way, is an early form of heaven and hell. As Daniel has it, I think it's experimental, that it's not fully worked out yet. Not everybody gets assigned either up or down, but the very good go up, the very bad go down. And there seems to be allowance that some people just may not rise at all.
So it makes me want to know maybe what influenced these ideas, if it's Persian, if it's Greek or what. It just fascinates me to wonder about this, but I don't want to die on any hills of genetic connections or potential influence, because we can't be too confident on that.
There are some parallels in Greece for the idea of astral immortality, but it wasn't all that common. Now, whether that played a part in it, we don't really know. I think the main idea seems to be that they thought that the good would be taken up to join the heavenly host. And you get that also in the book of Enoch.
So my final assessment as we're dealing with this, we've nailed Daniel. We didn't get into how Daniel's using an already failed prophecy by Jeremiah to kind of, the can got kicked down the road, if you will. And so they're now trying to make, a fulfillment out of the can. And now they got to kick other Jews and Christians later. They're taking the can that was kicked down the road again of this failed prophecy and kind of redoing it. And that's because they're still, another way to put it, like the book of Revelation says, no more tears, no more death, no more darkness, no more suffering, no more, because there is those actual things in the world of these people. Technically, this still needs to be fulfilled. Cognitive dissonance. I don't need to go into what they do with failed prophecy here, but in the book of Revelation, I know we're not nailing that. I'm getting Olivia to join me on a deep dive, but I see a similar thrust. These predictions, hints at Jerusalem already being destroyed, in the city where the Lord was crucified, Revelation 11. And I never was able to interview your wife before she completely retired. But is there any teasing you can give us on what you think Babylon is in Revelation 17? And it's like, there seems to be this thrust toward predictive language in the visionary way in which this angel's portraying it to John about what is soon to come, using already happened stuff like the war.
Yeah.
How do you interpret this in a few?
Well, I mean, in the book of Revelation, Babylon is obviously Rome. It's the city on 7 hills. And, it's Babylon because Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. Therefore, Rome is the new Babylon.
What would you say to someone who says the zealots who took over the temple destroyed Jerusalem?
Baloney. They may not have liked the zealots. They may not have approved of them, but no, they were not the ones who destroyed Jerusalem.
Would it be a red flag too?
A huge tour de force to blame, to cast Babylon as symbolizing Jews. Doesn't make any sense.
And one more observation that I recently looked at that really made red flags, because Revelation loves to quote scripture, and it does a midrashic kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I see Nebuchadnezzar as almost like a template where he's forcing them to worship him in his image. And you get this language about this beast who's like demanding worship. And I thought, because I've got people in the preterist camps and online who
Yeah.
want to say it's all Jerusalem. Babylon's Jerusalem. They want to make everything Jerusalem. A lot of conservative Christians do this that are preterist, as you well know. And huge red flags to me is like, when did these Jews, zealots, whatever you want to call them, Sakari, other people have different identities. Steve Mason disagrees with them as being a category anyway, that they set themselves up as God to be worshipped.
No.
That is not a true Jew would never like push that. I can see an emperor doing that, or at least an imperial cult, but it just didn't make any sense to me either.
No. I mean, what you will find is that people think sometimes that the destruction of Jerusalem was triggered by the zealots, by the impious actions that were done in Jerusalem. And therefore, God allowed the Romans to destroy it.
Got it.
But you will not ever find them saying that the zealots were the ones who destroyed it.
Got it. Okay. So they could have played a part.
Rome.
You are fantastic.
On this business of reinterpretation, are you familiar with 4th Ezra?
I am. I'm not as familiar, of course, like off the top of my head and memorizing the whole thing, but I have read it many times.
Towards the end of 4th Ezra, there are a few great visions, and then an angel explains them to Ezra. And at one point, it sees an eagle coming up out of the sea, which isn't a very felicitous image in a way. It's heavy-handed, but the eagle is Rome, obviously. And he says to Daniel, now this, to Ezra, this is the 4th beast that I showed in a vision to your brother Daniel, but I didn't explain it to him the way I'm explaining it to you.
Love this.
That I think is beautiful. So they need the reinterpreting.
Yes. You know what? I have to admit, as I was a fundamentalist most of my life, and I thought, this is it, man. This is amazing. And then, you grow up a little, you learn a little bit more, you are willing to go beyond your comfort zone. And now I'm in love with this stuff in a whole new light because there's so much more depth to it to me to see how humans just keep using these things and doing it. There's so many almost like treasure troves of secrets to discover, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Now, if we're talking about predictions in Daniel, we've got to also deal with the ones that the book ends with.
Please.
In chapter 12. From the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that desolates is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now, we know exactly when the burnt offering was taken away. We may not know the exact date at this point, but we know the year, certainly. And 1,290 days. And then the next verse says, happy are those who persevere and attain the 1,335 days. Now, so you're given two different numbers. Why? You've referred to cognitive dissonance and Leon Festinger's famous book, When Prophecy Fails. This is a well-known phenomenon, say, with the Millerites and those people in the 19th century. If your prophecy is not fulfilled, what's the first thing you do? Recalculate. You say, maybe I made a mistake in the math.
Right.
Maybe the Lord has given us an extension. And it takes quite a while before you come round to saying, gee, I was wrong about that. You remember Harold Camping?
Yes, sir.
A little over 10 years ago, predicted the end of the world in some days in August. And, he was interviewed afterwards, if you know Zeke Peastrap.
Yes.
Well, Zeke interviewed him, and Camping actually said, well, I guess I got that wrong. And I must say this increased my respect for Harold Camping enormously. He was at heart an honest man, and he was able to admit that he got something wrong.
Wow.
Now, but in the case of Daniel, Josephus, writing, 200 years later, or a bit more, said, Daniel was the greatest of the prophets. He not only said what would happen, he said when it would happen. And you want to shake Josephus and say, but Josephus, he got it wrong. And Josephus, I'm sure, would have said, oh, no. You just have to interpret it.
Another calculation.
It's a mystery. And, people have taken these numbers and reinterpreted them in every century since then.
And the 490 year, right?
Yes.
So,
and, one thing is like with the Lord, 1,000 years is as a day. Well, if that's the case, it could be quite a while yet.
Exactly. And didn't he end up drawing the conclusion that Vespasian was the predicted Messiah, which was odd? Jews would have never.
This was Josephus.
Right.
The reference was to an ambiguous oracle, as he calls it, that a man from the east would rule the world. And we don't really know what that oracle was or where he got it. But his stroke of genius when he was captured by the Romans was to say, that's Vespasian. That is you, Vespasian. And Vespasian was impressed. And indeed, Vespasian then became Roman emperor. And this proved that Josephus was a prophet.
Right.
Wow. This was a conversion like what we have seen with J.D. Vance. Of somebody who goes from fighting the Romans to somebody who goes predicting the next ruler of the world.
Dr. Collins, there's so much to dive into with your works. I really appreciate this. We now have high confidence. We should. Daniel made predictions that did not come to pass at the end there. We didn't even really ask why this is written and what was, a little psychology. But, I know that Jonathan Z. Smith and others talk about this, in blessed memory, about the idea of why write apocalypses to begin with. And this one idea, I'd like to end on this, if you're okay with that. And that is, a lot of people online have come up with the idea that really it's Jerusalem. They see a constant condemnation of Jerusalem in the Gospels. They think Paul's pro-Roman because in Romans 13, he says, pay your taxes, and God put Rome in control. So they almost see this thrust mostly throughout the New Testament as if the New Testament is just pro-Roman and anti-Jerusalem cult through and through, meaning they don't find condemnation of Rome. And so they get to the book of Revelation and they interpret that same lens of how can we fit this where Rome is not condemned and it all matches Jerusalem. And so they come up with ideas. Even Barker has made this attempt and such, that the city on the seven hills, she's looking for a Jerusalem that might have seven hills. She's trying to find evidence that supports that. And what would you say?
Save your time with Margaret Barker.
I will. What do you think about that whole notion? Because I personally understand why they wouldn't outright condemn. They killed. This would be clearly treacherous to the empire, right?
I don't think they're even being all that subtle.
Really?
The Babylon analogy is very blatant, very open. Well, at least very open to any Jewish person. Now, whether the Romans, the whole thing may just sound like gibberish to the Romans. Fourth Ezra, using the eagle, is much more transparent. But now, there was a strong movement in New Testament scholarship in the first decade of this century of empire studies, which was going to the opposite extreme. And Paul was anti-empire. Jesus was anti-empire. And that, too, I think, was a little bit off the deep end.
Like John Dominic Crossan kind of, in a way.
He got in on it. Yes, eventually. Right. Horsley would have been a more extreme proponent.
Got it.
No, Horsley was an old 60s radical himself, whereas Dominic really just went with the fashion of the moment.
I've heard it was his experience in Ireland, and that I think Del Allison Jr., when I talked to him, kind of thought that maybe his issues with, what has happened, civil war in Ireland, played maybe a role in some way to his interpretation.
Not that much with Dominic. I know Dominic very well, but
okay.
But anyhow,
well, I don't want to psychoanalyze.
Yeah. Don't want to get into discussing those. But I'm just saying that both extremes are wrong. Now, okay. I mean, the Book of Revelation is vehemently anti-Roman. I don't think there's any doubt about that, and there isn't any doubt that Rome is what is being attacked. Paul, I think, is much more subtle. Paul didn't want trouble with the Romans. Therefore, he says, pay your taxes. For that of it, even Jesus said, pay your taxes. He wasn't looking for confrontation, but they weren't pro-Roman, or they weren't either really pro or anti-Roman. I think they, wanted to steer away from all of that, but not the Book of Revelation. The Book of Revelation, I think, is quite open about it.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. John J. Collins, Emeritus, ladies and gentlemen. Get his books if you haven't. Where have you been on this planet? If you haven't read one of them, at least. Any final words from you to someone who might be researching apocalypticism, investigating biblical studies, encouragement, anything you'd like to add?
Look, it's great stuff. It's endlessly fascinating. And it's kind of fun besides. you'd better not take it too seriously. I'm not sure. It's been said, but one of the reasons why people wrote apocalypses was to have hope in times when there was no hope. And so what they typically hope for is for the Son of Man to come on the clouds of heaven, or the Archangel Michael to appear and solve their problems. And while you think that that is going to happen, may give you great comfort, if you get into the state where you think it is actually happening, you're in trouble. And there have been some notorious cases of that.
Right.
Of people who think the end has come. That's the Millerite tragedy.
In that case, just to give people context, so they know,
Yeah.
some people sold their homes, their farms, their livelihoods. And I think this happened with camping, Harold Camping as well. Some of the devout followers believed it was happening and literally got rid of their property. I mean, forsake your goods, right? You're going to heaven, baby. That's scary that people actually are believing this stuff, literally.
So keep it in the future.
Thank you so much, ladies and
Talk
gentlemen.
to you, Derek.
Thank you. Bye.